Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive systemic failure, and we're going to start things off with a true crime story that exposes exactly how the whole shebang happened. I want you to meet Brooke Stewart. She's a woman from St. Joseph, Missouri. When a global crisis hit and the government was practically scrambling to distribute emergency relief funds, Stewart, well, she didn't panic. Instead, she saw an unprecedented opportunity. She executed a scheme that was honestly as brazen as it was revealing, and it completely exposed a massive, glaring blind spot in how our government and financial institutions actually communicate with each other.
Okay, let's dive into this. Between May 2020 and June 2021, Brooke Stewart successfully stole exactly this amount, $139,663 in CARES Act unemployment benefits. Now, stealing unemployment funds during the pandemic was unfortunately pretty common, but it's the how of it all that is so utterly fascinating. She didn't just sit there and invent fake people out of thin air. No, she used the real identities of 5 state and federal prison inmates to push through these fraudulent claims, alongside using her own identity and one other.
Which brings us to a really crucial question. I mean, think about it. Why target incarcerated individuals? If you're going to commit identity fraud, why pick people who are visibly, legally, and physically locked up and therefore literally entirely ineligible for unemployment benefits? It seems like it would be the easiest fraud to catch, right? Well, actually, scratch that. It's a really dark kind of counterintuitive brilliance. You see, incarcerated individuals represent a highly distinctive identity fraud risk. Their personal information, we're talking names, social security numbers, it all remains completely valid and active out in the real world. But crucially, their ability to detect or challenge any misuse is virtually non-existent. An inmate has basically zero access to financial statements. They definitely can't check their credit monitoring services. They don't have active digital accounts, and any suspicious tax documents, those might just be sent to an old address or simply sit there undiscovered. So, to the automated government systems processing these claims, the identity appears perfectly administratively credible, but the actual genuine person is completely cut off from the ordinary verification or complaint processes that would typically raise a red flag.
Just to be absolutely clear here, the prisoners named in these claims were victims, not co-conspirators. None of the incarcerated individuals whose identities were used received a single cent of those fraudulent payments. And it's also really worth noting that Stewart wasn't just some random opportunist who got lucky. When she committed this federal offense, she was already on supervision following a 2019 state conviction for, you guessed it, trafficking in stolen identities. This tells us something absolutely vital. Emergency disbursement programs are absolute magnets for experienced offenders who already possess these illicit data networks and the technical know-how to exploit them.
Section 1. The Scale, a multi-billion-dollar problem.
Now, Brooke Stewart was eventually caught and sentenced to 2.5 years in federal prison, but her case was just a micro example of a much, much larger macro problem. Pandemic fraud wasn't just a handful of isolated opportunists, it exploded into one of the largest identity-enabled fraud events in recent U.S. history. Just look at this staggering number. The Government Accountability Office estimated that fraudulent unemployment insurance payments made between April 2020 and May 2023 hit somewhere between $100 billion and $135 billion. To put that into perspective, that is an almost incomprehensible amount of money just bleeding out of the system in barely 3 years. And this massive vulnerability wasn't just contained to unemployment insurance either. The wider pandemic relief environment affected at least 19 federal programs. We're talking massive, high-profile initiatives like the Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loans. Basically, if a program was prioritizing the rapid disbursement of funds, it was being actively targeted. The sheer scale of the criminal response was, frankly, industrialized. By the end of 2024, at least 2,532 defendants had been found guilty of offenses involving pandemic relief programs. And here is the real kicker. Nearly half of those convicted defendants faced conspiracy charges. So we're not just talking about lone wolves clicking around on a laptop. This was organized, systemic fraud executed by highly coordinated groups. Section 2, Anatomy of the Scheme. How emergency fraud scaled. Now, what's really interesting about this is how exactly criminals executed these schemes so efficiently all across the country. To understand how we lost billions, we have to break down the actual mechanics of the fraud itself. It really comes down to what's known as the artificial identity journey. This is totally different from synthetic identity fraud, where criminals fabricate a fake person by mashing up real and fictional traits. Here, the named claimant is a 100% real, identifiable person with a totally valid social security number, just like our prisoners. But the contact info, the email, the phone number, and most importantly, the destination bank account, those are entirely hijacked and controlled by the fraudster. Because the core identity is completely real, it just breezes right past basic format checks. Criminals basically capitalized on a perfect storm of vulnerabilities. First off, speed. Because governments prioritize the sheer speed of getting money out to unprecedented numbers of people, the normal everyday controls were totally overwhelmed. This was made even worse by fragmented administration. Fraudsters figured out they could exploit inconsistent state systems to submit the exact same stolen data package across multiple jurisdictions. Add in remote access, where literally nobody had to show up in person. Plus, illicit markets already flooded with real data from previous breaches, and criminals had everything they needed on a silver platter. They could seamlessly funnel funds into flexible, untraceable prepaid cards or digital accounts, yanking the money out rapidly before anyone even caught on.
Section 3. Why the systems failed. The Great Disconnect.
So you're probably wondering, why did our conventional multi-layered security controls miss this massive wave of activity happening right in front of them? Well, it's like a giant puzzle where different agencies hold different pieces, but nobody is looking at the same table. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact problem. On one side, you have the government workforce agency, basing a claimant's identity, their employment history, and their declarations of eligibility. On the totally opposite side, the regulated financial institution, the bank, sees the customer account, the incoming government payment, and the rapid cash withdrawals. Both sides are looking at these seemingly legitimate half pictures, but neither side has the full evidence needed to actually spot the crime. And in the case of Brooks Stewart and the incarcerated identities, there was a third totally missing piece: the prison authority. They were the ones holding the crucial data proving the claimant was actually locked up and ineligible. But because these records just weren't being compared in real time, the fraud slipped right through the cracks. In fact, a recent Department of Labor audit found that inconsistent access to the Social Security Administration's prisoner update processing system left a staggering $267.3 million in potentially fraudulent pandemic unemployment payments entirely undetected. Unbelievable, right? Which brings us straight to the fatal flaw in the system's logic during the crisis. Identity verification was mistakenly treated as confirmation of eligibility and account control. But as our source material notes, verifying that a social security number and name belong to a real person absolutely does not establish that the person actually submitted the application, is entitled to the benefit, or actually controls the receiving bank account. Because the government application process completely failed to catch this, the burden suddenly shifted onto the regulated financial sector. Banks and fintechs were suddenly flying blind and had to rely heavily on transaction patterns to spot the fraud. FinCEN stepped in and identified massive red flags for them to look out for. Things like out-of-state accounts suddenly receiving local benefits, blatant name mismatches, or multiple different claimants all funneling their benefits into one single account, only for those newly deposited funds to be instantly withdrawn or wired right out of the country through peer-to-peer transfers.
Section 4. Building better defenses. The solution for the next crisis.
So the money is gone, the system's failed, and the criminals have already evolved. For investigators, untangling this mess is an enforcement tale that's easily going to last a decade, maybe more. Moving forward, an evidence-led investigation means going way, way beyond basic account ownership. We literally have to reconstruct the complete claim-to-cash timeline, test eligibility against independent records, like those prison databases, figure out who effectively controlled the account by tracking shared IP addresses, and execute deep network analysis to connect seemingly isolated claims right back to the larger organized rings they truly belong to. Let's move to and see how this builds into what financial crime leaders absolutely must implement to prevent this from happening again. It's called the resilient control stack. This means fundamentally separating identity verification from eligibility right off the bat, and executing prepayment data matches against things like prisoner and death records before a single dime is ever released. It requires verifying that the recipient account actually matches the claimant while seamlessly sharing network intelligence across agencies to spot organized infrastructure. When you combine that with real-time institutional monitoring for those FinCEN red flags and rapid interdiction protocols to free suspected payments instantly, we can finally create targeted friction for criminals without slowing down access for the citizens who are in true need. If there is one core takeaway you remember from all this source material, it is this: pandemic unemployment fraud became industrialized because criminals connected identity data, remote applications, and payment infrastructure so much faster than government and financial institutions connected their controls. Pure and simple, data fragmentation was the ultimate enabler of this multi-billion-dollar loss.
The time to design identity services, data sharing agreements, and investigation protocols is absolutely not after the losses become systemic. It's right now. Which leaves us with one final, very critical question for every financial and government leader watching this. Will your resilient control stack be built before the next emergency begins? Because let me tell you, the criminals are already building theirs. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and stay focused.